This decade has not begun as everyone expected. The COVID-19 crisis hit, then there was the start of the war in Ukraine. And according to Craig Hamilton Parker, the start of World War III is on the horizon. Hamilton Parker is known for his regular use of predictions, many of them accurate. For example, he even predicted the death of Queen Elizabeth II, who died last September. He also predicted the outcome of the Brexit referendum and the arrival of Donald Trump as President of the United States. As the seer said, World War III will begin in 2023, and it will all start in Taiwan, known to be the cause of conflicts with China, as they have a tense relationship that has been growing increasingly heated in recent months. According to Hamilton Parker, it will be triggered by the collision of two aircraft or submarines, which will set off a series of events. Others like me, while we agree with Hamilton Clark's timeline, I disagree that the spark will not occur until the Taiwan-Chinese potential conflict. Rather, I think all the elements for a spark to ignite World War III are already existent in Ukraine, or at least are culminating. Here's a recent clip of Tobias Ellwood, head of the British Parliament's Defence Committee, telling the British population that they need to be directly involved in a war with Russia.
Now at war in Europe, we need to move to a war footing. We are involved in that. We've mobilized our procurement processes. We're gifting equipment. We need to face Russia directly and rather than leaving Ukraine to do all the work.
Mr. Ellwood's words become even more likely to occur when taken in the context that the reality that a Ukrainian victory is no longer plausible is starting to seep into the minds of Western officials. Here's a clip of British Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell on Times Radio.
From a strategic perspective, the worry here is this actually a war that's winnable from a Ukraine perspective, and is it losable from a Russian perspective, given that Putin only wanted a special military operation? If you explore those questions, the danger is you come to the conclusion that this is possibly and not a winnable war for Ukraine. Ukraine will probably never liberate Crimea and the Donbass, and therefore it's more a question of where the line gets drawn on a map as to when the war stops. And the West has got lots of its domestic priorities. Here in London we have there's a cost of living crisis, there's an inflation crisis, we don't have the weapons in our inventory. We're doing the best we can to support Ukraine, but we can't keep going like this.
Then we have the recent decision of President Putin to withdraw from the Obama New START treaty, which limited the number of tactical nuclear weapons that both the US and Russia could have. And this was something that Putin once defended. This, coupled with NATO's inclination to continue to provide Ukraine with weapons, and more recently, long-range weapons that can strike deep into Russia and hit supply lines, all points to one direction: continued escalation and the increasing chance of World War III. This is what I'll be discussing today in today's video, in this lesser known but insightful article from Asia Times, published since the 23rd of February 2023, appropriately titled, World War III is already here. But before we get into today's video, please remember to click the subscribe button and help the algorithm push this video. And without further ado, let's get into it. This past week will be remembered by most historians, if anyone is lucky enough to live through this age of self-destruction, as the point of no return for the Russo-Ukrainian war. The world was treated, or more like tormented, by dueling presidential speeches. One from the sclerotic US President Joe Biden, who journeyed to Kiev to reassert his undying support for Ukraine, the other by the surly Russian President Vladimir Putin. Neither speech was particularly reassuring. Biden promised his Ukrainian wards an additional US $500 million in US taxpayer support for the besieged Ukrainians. Shortly after his speech, the Pentagon hinted that it might stop slow-walking its promised, but as yet to be delivered, M1A2 Abrams main battle tank to the waiting arms of the desperate Ukrainian defenders and simply hand over the MBTs that are already in America's warehouses, something the Pentagon had resisted doing when the Biden administration made its initial announcement that it would, in fact, be sending the vaunted MBTs. The other speech came from Putin, who spoke for a whopping 2 hours on Tuesday evening, in which he reiterated his commitment to total victory over Ukraine and how the United States was ruled by Satanists and pedophiles. Unsurprisingly, most Western media outlets simply refused to cover the speech. Those few that did were openly derisive. The speech certainly was Castro-esque in its loquaciousness, and was tinged with quasi-religious accusations against the West that would make most Iranian mullahs blush. But there was substance in Putin's words. He not only signaled that his commitment to the conflict was as strong as ever, but that he was escalating it in response to what he viewed as an American escalation. In fact, Putin issued his first significant threat toward the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He told his American rivals that they were to remove their offensive long-range weapons in Ukraine, otherwise Russian forces would begin directly targeting those systems. Here is a red line that NATO and the Americans should think twice about crossing. You see, these systems will be used by Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia. And while Ukraine certainly has a right to defend itself, the fact that it is doing so with capabilities that it only has thanks to the Americans means that the United States and NATO are now, in the eyes of Putin, direct combatants. What's more, should these weapon systems be targeted by the Russians, one can anticipate that Americans will die. After all, just as with Russian S-400 emplacements in Syria, the American long-range weapons are undoubtedly staffed or maintained at least partly by Americans. Plus, there are likely American forces operating covertly in and around these long-range systems, so we can expect that the Russian targeting of these systems and their surrounding environments will result in multiple American casualties. The key takeaway from these two speeches that were delivered hours apart from each other is that there is now no hope for a peace deal. For Putin to pull Russia out of an agreement of which he was a vociferous defender should raise hairs on the backs of the necks of Washington policymakers. Yet all these statements have done is to harden Washington's zeal in blindly supporting its Ukrainian proxy. Putin's decision to withdraw from the treaty speaks to the depths that he is willing to go to ensure that he wins this war. Thus, compromise is not possible at this rate. The only thing that would make a peace deal tenable for Russia would be if its military were decisively defeated. While the Russians have certainly taken heavy losses, Ukraine has also taken significant losses. Unlike the Ukrainians, the Russians can afford to keep sending hundreds of thousands of their people into the meat grinder until they simply attrit the Ukrainians. Until Russia's larger forces bleed Ukraine's forces dry in the field and then surge over their corpses. This at least appears to be the general Russian plan. The Ukrainians have made their intentions clear since before the conflict erupted a year ago. Kiev wants the complete restoration of Crimea and eventually eastern Ukraine. But that too is a red line that, if crossed, will likely trigger Moscow into risking nuclear war. Russia cannot lose its naval base in Sevastopol. If it does, it ceases being a major power, or it is isolated away from the vital Black Sea region. The West is living in a pure fantasy if its so-called leadership thinks that Putin will simply sit back and watch this unfold. That was the point of Putin's long-winded speech. The war isn't ending. There will be no negotiated settlement, at least not one anytime soon, or one that favors the Western side. Beijing is now getting involved more directly on the side of Moscow, meaning that Russia will have greater maneuvering room at a time when the West desperately needs the Russians to be isolated. Why would Russia seek peace if the war is turning in its favor as it is? And lastly, face it, there will be no peace in our time. The recent speeches made by Biden and Putin, as well as the increasing involvement of China in the Ukraine conflict, mean that war is our lot, and this war is not one the West can easily win.